I'm there. I
All
exist.
right. Good to see you, man.
What absolute pleasure. Good to see you. How's everything?
Everything, well, crazy, but busy, but great. I mean, aside from, the state of the world,
Yeah, of course. That's
this
yeah.
nation.
It's a given, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, another day in fascism. Besides that, everything is good.
So, thank you for being part of the panel the last time. I look forward to seeing you again on one of those.
What an absolute pleasure, sir. Thanks for having me on. Man. I appreciate it.
I'm a storyteller, as you might know by now.
Of course.
Just, making films, and it started with comics back in Colombia. And I always want to go back to where you first fell in love with comics, how that happened. I know it's very different here than in Colombia, for example, but were they easily accessible to you? Was there somebody in your family that was a fan of comics? Or?
No one in my family. I first got into comics in the typical way of my generation, which was my mother was a dedicated smoker. And so when she would buy a pack of cigarettes, just to kind of make me feel good about dragging me to the newsstand, which we had back in the day, she'd buy a $1 comic and throw it at me. And I'd read some comics that way. I'd read some Superman and some Fantastic Fours. And one day when I was about 9 years old, she threw Avengers 300, which is by Walt Simonson and John Buscema. It's a completely forgettable issue. Even Walt Simonson completely forgets it because I've talked to him. But it blew my little mind. And it was like a totally different Avengers team, and at the back they had like a list of all the Avengers members and all the issues were. And I was like, I love this. It appealed to me for all the classic reasons. I was a nerd. I was no good at like running fast or throwing balls in hoops. I liked sitting in a corner and reading, and I loved the fantasy of people and superheroes dressing up and beating up bullies. It was very appealing to a little nerd. And I'm a natural collector to this day. I don't know. I have that gene that some people have where like they want to. So when I saw like a list of like all the things I could buy and connect them all together and like, why is he Giant Man in this? And then he's Ant-Man in this. And then he's Goliath. I went to my local bookstore, which had a spinner rack, and I started buying from there. And then eventually I found a local I grew up in the west side of Los Angeles. And I eventually found a regular comic book store down in Culver City. And then I was just, that was how I spent my childhood, was enmeshed in comic books. It was I used to look at the world as like, okay, I can go to Grandpa's house and he'll ask me to help him in the yard and he'll pay me $5. That's 5 comics for a visit to Grandpa's house. and all that stuff. But yeah, I was all in as a kid, just reading as many comic books. Like, well, thank God, because it built the foundations of everything I do with my entire life. My parents thought I was wasting my time, and in fact, that's bought me houses and cars and, and put my kids through school. So it was a good use of time.
I was lucky. My parents are a psychologist and a social worker, and they just let me run wild. So when I started drawing comics in math class, I was so bad in math. And I was just drawing comics like in 3rd grade. And my dad is the only one. He always supported me and started getting me books. And I fell in love completely with that stuff.
My parents were not into comics. They did not. They thought it was a waste of money and time and energy. And I was not a rebellious kid. I think this was my rebellion, was to sort of spend my time doing that. They thought they would never buy me a comic book. That's why it all had to be earned. It all had to be, I had to sort of self-generate. And my mother told me one of the great lies, which I tell my children who can listen because they're on the other side of that door, which is I really wanted to work in comics. I really just wanted to be part of it somehow. And she's like, if you get good grades in school, someday you'll work in comics. And so I was like, all right. I'm dedicating myself to getting. She totally manipulated me. She's like, I see you want this, and it totally worked. And I was like, get straight A's because I want to work in comics.
Yeah, I remember I used to get my lunch money would be one comic. I would just run to the drugstore and see the racks and just grab one comic. And there were some books that changed my life. I didn't know how big they would become, but I remember just browsing through things. And the first 2 that just I fell in love with, and I couldn't get them yet because they were expensive, were those bound versions of Alan Moore's Watchmen. And the Frank Miller one that's sort of leather bound that has the 3 he had done up till then. It was like, of course, year 1, Dark Knight, but also like a Christmas story that he had done.
Yeah.
And that little version, I now own like every possible version of those stories, even the artist, versions. But that little one, I still have it all ripped to pieces of how many times I just went through that stuff, and it just changed my life when I eventually got those.
I still have some. If you look behind some of these are my trades from when I was a kid. Like I have this incredible Hulk trade I took with me on a camp trip when I was 12 years old. You can see it's like so torn up and like
Peter David stuff.
Peter David,
McFarlane on the cover.
Yeah, my God, with Todd McFarlane doing this incredible work. So I totally relate to it. Every Christmas, my tradition was I would reread Dark Knight Returns as a kid, like 9-10 years old. Like that was my favorite comic. I was like, every Christmas is the time I get a chance to reread it again because I thought it was so awesome and appealed to me so much.
Yeah, but wait. But wasn't your mom? So they didn't support comics. They weren't storytellers, but your mom worked for Warner Brothers or something like that, right?
Yes. So my dad sort of left the scene when I was like 7-8 years old. So I was raised primarily by my mother and my grandmother. But my mother was an executive at a number of companies. She worked at Universal, Fox, Warner Brothers, and Paramount. So she kind of did the whole town.
Very helpful.
Yeah, but she was a lawyer and very much on the business side. She most famous. She was part of the team that helped invent DVD back in the day. So she won it. The team won an Emmy. I got to go see her, when this was and hold the awards. But because she worked on the business side of entertainment, and I think we can all kind of relate to that, she very much viewed Hollywood as like a lottery. Like she's like, this is not something you earn; it's something you win. Mm-hmm. And so she in her mind, it was like, you just can't gamble your life. Like she just wasn't a gambler. So she's like, no, don't be a writer. Don't be an actor, be a lawyer, be a doctor, something where you can work hard and climb a ladder. She thought Hollywood was such a roll of dice. It had sort of nothing to do with talent and more to do with all sort of these other intangibles that were just too hard to capture. So she was very much against career. It didn't help that my older brother had decided to become a musician. So I was like the only one, there were only two of us. So I was her last hope for having a stable, normal kid. So yeah.
I was the trifecta of worries for other parents, not mine, luckily, but because I said I want to do comics when I grow up. That was my thing. Yeah. And then I got into film and then music. So the three things that people warned their kids not to go through.
My mother didn't see she thought there were no ladders to success in Hollywood. There are ladders you can climb. It's not, from the outside, it seems like, you just have to be, like Orson Welles, kind of this Proteus who rises in flame. But no, most directors and writers, they intern first. They find an assistant job. They work in a small. Of course, talent rises to the top, but there is a way to get into the system, and it's not all a lottery. There is, just like a lawyer starts at a law firm and works their way up. There is that works for directors and writers and even actors on some level.
What was the first story you wrote, even for yourself as a kid, or when did that become like a possibility in your mind? I
mean, I was always writing stories in my mind. I mean, I was the kind of kid who hated to be bored, so whenever I was kind of doing nothing, I would kind of make up stories in my head. And, I played G.I. Joes infinitely, just making up. So that was like the most practice I ever got for storytelling. I was just being a kid and playing G.I. Joes and stuff. I was very good at English and creative writing. So I did some stories, especially when there was a big transformation from 8th and 9th grade when I took it more seriously and kind of started understanding what sort of prose was. And I was a step ahead on all these creative writing courses I was taking because I had read comics and I knew all these like little tricks. Because I read Dark Knight Returns 30 times. So I could start seeing, I was like, because Frank uses these wonderful tricks of like foreshadowing and theme repetition and slow builds and fast builds and cutaways. And I kind of was assimilated into that into me, but faster than most kids who are reading novels are much more complicated to understand sort of what they're doing in terms of storytelling. I was very discouraged from being sort of any creative thing. I didn't want to tell anybody that's what I wanted to do. So I didn't major in creative writing in college, but I interned at Marvel in DC, and at DC I was basically a copy boy. I copied. I photocopied pages back in the day. Back in the day, artists would send in their pages, you'd photocopy them on the machine, and then you'd send them out to the writers to do the lettering drafts. Right. And so I was the guy who did the photocopying. Well, what prestige that was.
Well, that's how it works in the agencies and production companies, right? Where you start here.
Yes. exactly. There's a long history of Marvel. Dan Slott was a Marvel intern. Tim Seeley was a Marvel intern. James Tynion was a Marvel intern, or was a DC intern.
Uh-huh.
There's quite a few of us out there who interned our way into the business. And then at Marvel, I was Chris Claremont's assistant. And Chris was like the chief creative director. This is the late 90s.
And what part of his X-Men run was that?
It was after X-Men. Okay. Marvel was in this weird position where they had gotten rid of their core line and replaced them with the image creators to create this.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was
Heroes Reborn or something.
Heroes Reborn, yeah. Rob and Jim kind of took over the company for like a year and a half, and it didn't really work out. And so they had to kind of redo everything, and so they rehired the guys they had fired 3 or 4 years ago, and that was Chris was one of the guys they rehired, and they brought him in to kind of try to capture the old magic. He was writing Fantastic Four back then.
What were the lessons then that maybe hold up to this day?
I mean, there were some fascinating lessons. I mean, it was a great. Couldn't ask for a better way to learn to write, because Chris is an absolute master. And if you've ever talked to Chris, and I don't think you'd be shy about admitting this, he has opinions. He's not the kind of guy who kind of quietly sits there in a corner. And my job was basically like sit and listen to, because Chris's job at that time was he was going to read all the scripts and sort of note them. And so he read every script that came in, and I would also read, and it's cool because reading comic book scripts. So I would sit there for 80 hours, whatever it was, 4 hours a day, and I would just read the comic scripts, and Chris would read the screen scripts, and then we'd get together, and he would tell me why each one of them was terrible, because he hated everything that wasn't his, and so it was just sitting there listening to Chris talk and dissect story after story after story after story. You couldn't help but learn things. Probably the lesson I still return to from that, if I had to pick one out of all, I mean, Chris had all those sort of Marvel opinions that I probably disagree with some of them. Stuff like this comic has to be its first comic. That's why if you reading Chris Claremont comic, Wolverine's always like, I'm the best at what I do, and what I do is, and he explains his powers and stuff. He was super into that. But the big writing lesson, I remember, the one that sort of blew my mind, it seems very simple now, but he was talking about that the easiest thing to write in the world was Star Trek. And I said, why is Star Trek so easy to write? He said, Captain Kirk is so easy to write. I was like, why is Captain Kirk? And he goes, because his brain is outside his body. I was like, what does that mean? He goes, oh, well, he has Spock and Bones who are kind of with him. He has the Doctor. And so the logical part of his brain is talking, and then the emotional part of his brain is talking, and they have conversations, and then Kirk kind of settles them. Spock and Bones are just extensions of Kirk that help you tell this story. And I was like, no, they're separate characters. I never sort of thought of, I was like, oh yeah, they're just all roads point back because he's the hero. Like it changed how I just thought of how, as a writer, you think of things, as a reader, everything seems necessary and separate, but as a writer, everything is contingent and can change and be molded. And in that way, yes, you view Spock and Bones not as characters, but as a way to tell your story, and that absolutely blew my mind. And when you're writing Batman, you can think of Alfred and Gordon almost exactly as you think of sort of Bones and Spock, and sort of being Batman's emotion and his reservation, at the same time. So yeah,
it makes perfect sense because it dramatizes things with conflict that two characters may have. It's easier to portray that way than just somebody talking to themselves or thinking. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly. Yeah. And then being like, it portrays all, like, as a human being, when you approach any decision, should I be on this podcast, or think, oh, maybe should I die? And all of that stuff. It's really hard to portray without using shitty voiceover. But in Star Trek, you don't have to do that, because should I be in this podcast? And Spock's like, you should, because you. But then Bo's like, no, you hate it. You don't have time. And like all that internal conflict is suddenly external and becomes much more dramatic between these two characters. And so, yeah, that was the lesson. That's directly from Chris, and I still use it every day.
Speaking of Chris, I always wonder how the hell that worked so well, because one of the great seminal works that influenced me was also the whole Phoenix Saga, and all of that was one of the things I thought when I was a kid. And I was always thinking, because Byrne is also so opinionated, I can't imagine. But maybe that's how magic happens sometimes, just the clash of titans fighting.
They very famously did not like each other.
Yeah.
I've been in comics for 10 years. I've never been in an adversarial relationship with my artist. Not to say that we're always 100% on the same page, but never like that. And I was, but they've managed to do it and create great art. I mean, it's not the first time. Like, I mean, obviously Ditko and Lee hated each other, and then by the end, Kirby and Lee were hating each other. So, but maybe there's some magic there. Maybe I should try to get my artist to hate me a little more.
Well, maybe in the case with Byrne, somebody who really wants to be a writer too. That's the way to find the conflict. You know,
that's true. That is the way to find the conflict when you're artists. And trust me on this, I have worked for many, many artists who leave me and then become writers. I think because they see what I do and they're doing, oh, that's what Tom has done. Is so
I can do that.
Yeah. So I think that's but it's hard for an artist to write for themselves. It's a difficult task.
Yeah. One would assume you'd stick with comics once you're there interning, but then I guess the war happened and your career took a shift. And then how did you find your way? First, you wrote a book specifically about superheroes, right? So what happened that made you say finally, okay, I'm going to try my hand as a novelist?
Chris, that was my senior year in college. And at the very end of it, they gave me a writing gig. I was going to write The Black Knight as a book. And I was like, oh, this will be my career. I left college thinking I'm going to be a comic book writer. And that's going to be sort of how I'm going to spend my life. And this was 2000. And and then Marvel went bankrupt. Bob Harris wrote me a letter being like, comics are dead, kid. It was a very nice letter, but that was the sense of it. And I was like, oh, shit, okay. I guess that's not going to be my career because that industry doesn't exist anymore. And I went off to be a lawyer, and then 9/11 happened, and then I took a turn and did the CIA thing. What brought me back, my wife and I were sort of facing this possibility. She was pregnant with my first kid, Charlie, who's now 16, my goodness. And we were deciding if we were going to go. There were just a few options. I was a counterterrorism specialist who's did a lot of overseas, especially in war zones, places you couldn't bring a family. And so sort of the options, on the table was keep doing war zones and not, do a lot of gaps where I couldn't raise my kid, which was really tough. Like I said, I was raised without a dad. Switch my career path and do something a little less exciting, but be able to bring my kids with me. Or go back and live in Washington and be a desk, ride a desk, which I hated. I like being in the field. So we just I didn't like any of those options. and I was turning 30 and I was like, I always, for my whole life, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. And I was like, can I have it? Give me a shot. Give me a year. I'm going to take a year off. My wife is a lawyer. And I was like, I'll be a full-time stay-at-home dad. I'll take care of the kid. We don't have to get childcare. I'll change the diapers. And I'll write at night. And she's like, sure, you will. And if it doesn't work out, I was like, I'll take a year off. And if it doesn't work out, I'll go back to CIA after a year. And a year went by and I spent a year. I wrote my novel every night between 12 and 3. I was very disciplined. It helps if you're changing diapers all day to be disciplined because you're like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. And then by the time, that year was over, my daughter was on the way. So there was like another complication and I had an agent. I didn't have a book or I didn't have a novel, but I didn't have, a published, but I had an agent who was like, yeah, it's possible we could sell this thing. And so at that point I was like, I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to jump all in. And that's what we did. Like I quit CIA and jumped all in and worked on this book called Once Crowd Sky, and eventually got published. We sold it to Simon & Schuster, and then I was a published writer. Nobody bought the book. It was a big flop, but it exists.
I'm sure people are looking for it now to find, the roots of genius.
Yeah, I'm sure. Every time I see it, because to me it's like that's me learning to write. There's a lot of stuff in there that I'm like, oh, I could have done that a lot better. Oh, it's very much, like I said, I never took a class and I taught myself how to write. I'm very self-taught. I read a lot of books, but I never, so when I read that novel, I was like, oh, here's me trying this technique and here's me trying this technique and here's me trying that. I'm sort of finding my voice. But yeah, so that's the first sort of thing I published, and I became a novelist, I guess. It got great reviews. It got good reviews, but nobody bought the damn thing. made zero money.
And at no point did your wife say, well, you don't have to be in the CIA, you could be a lawyer again instead of a writer? She never suggested that.
Well, it's going back to law school, that's another $150,000.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right.
No, I mean, I have a very patient, wonderful wife. And like I said, I took care of my kids. I didn't just sort of slack off.
Yeah.
So I was performing sort of something that made me useful, I guess.
And something that not every man appreciates, the work that so many mothers do until they do it.
100%. Having been a stay-at-home, I've been a frontline counterterrorism CIA officer. I've been a writer for many years. I've written movies. I've written a TV show. A stay-at-home dad was the hardest job I ever had. There's no doubt. Not one cent of it. That was the toughest one. And it's actually like, now that you're older and can look back at your life, like spending 2.5 years with my kids when they were young, I got no regrets, man. That's some special stuff I got to see.
Sure.
That's
probably what matters most. And I'm sure that one way or the other, that's all showing up in your fiction in some ways, all of that.
Yeah, all of it. All that stuff is in there. But after my novel flopped, I was immediately starting to, that's when the freelancer disease started, where you're just like, time to get on the treadmill. So I got on that treadmill, and I had no idea how to do it. So I'd written, once you write your novel, and then before it comes out, you have like a year, right? There's like this gap. So in that time, I had written another novel, so we're trying to sell that, and I'd written. Was
that Sheriff, or because you wrote Sheriff as a novel as well, right?
Yeah. There were two novels. There was one before Sheriff. And Sheriff was the third novel I wrote. So I had those two novels, and then just as I was like, okay, I gotta get back and become a lawyer, or join CIA, or do something again. I really want to do comics. I wrote the novel to break into comics, and I started getting just a little bit of comic book work just in time to kind of drag me through, and then it kind of, my comic career, it took how many years to break in, but after I broke in, it went real fast.
Any of the contacts that you had from being an intern is still...
I would say, I think I can say yes, because the way I broke into comics was because Cliff Chiang, the artist, Cliff was going to draw the cover to my novel, and there's some spot illustrations in it, and then he had to drop out because he got the New 52 Wonder Woman gig. And I think he felt bad because it was a very last second kind of, I'm screwing you over, but not like he wasn't mean about it. He's just like, I got a big gig, I can't do this, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. And so I went up to him at a con after my book had come out, and I was like, I can't believe I was this brave. I was like, Cliff, my book came out, I got these great reviews, how do I use this to break into comics? And Cliff, God bless him, was like, I work for DC now, I'll give you a list of DC editors, you can email them and just use my name to be like, I know Cliff Chiang, I'm not a crazy person who's emailing you.
Yeah.
And so Cliff gave me all the email addresses for all the DC editors, and I wrote them all individually, about like which books I loved and why, and included, my reviews of my books and in Cliff's name. And then one of them, I probably wrote 10 editors.
Is that Jamie Rich when he appeared on the scene, or not yet?
No, this was Karen Berger was.
Who is now a Dark Horse, went to Dark Horse at some point. Yeah,
she for people to know, she's kind of a legend. She was the creator of Vertigo. Yeah, and was kind of responsible for the British invasion, the sort of Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Neil obviously has problems. Grant Morrison, the list of creators she found: Jason Aaron, Garth Ennis, like just the best of the best.
Incredible, yeah.
And Scott Snyder started over there, and I was the last. I was right before she left. I was the last one, and she was the one who got me off the pot. And I really think she probably picked me because I was in CIA, and I had I put there as I intern in Vertigo, and she's like, "Oh, you're a former intern," and she had a meeting with me, and out of that meeting, I got an 8-pager, which sort of was my first comic work, and then that led to Grayson, and then that led to all the rest of it.
It's funny, just to put things in perspective, because sometimes you say, I can't believe I was that brave to tell Cliff Chiang anything. And I'm like, dude, you're in the CIA, you were on the field, and you're like, it takes courage to walk out.
I know. I never, but I'm not, that took courage, but I don't know if that was a different kind of courage than to go up to someone you don't know and ask for a favor. That's super hard. It's the way to break into writing, and people will tell you this, it's contacts. And then if you don't have contacts, you're like, oh my God, what does that mean? 99% of us don't have contacts.
Right.
And so you have to build them, and building contacts is so hard. It means going to conventions, finding writers, writing to them. It's like this, and you have to walk this line between, being nice and being stalkery. It's like, it's very difficult. Takes a lot more bravery than getting shot at or something. When getting shot just feels like necessary. You're just like, okay, I'm here. There's no one else. I better do the job. It's just, I don't know. You're not.
That's so crazy to hear.
I don't know. It's a different kind of thing.
Wow. But it's interesting talking about that and the way to make your way in, because I don't know if you know this part of my career, I guess, but I taught a master's in screenwriting as well after doing a lot of coaching.
Oh, good. You can tell me what I'm doing wrong.
I could. No. But the students often ask, about the way in. And I think you had this. It's not just finding the open door, but being ready for it. You had the book that you had written, that you had spent all that time, and you had spent so much time learning the craft. On your own, but so that when the doors were open after knocking on them many times and going to many cons and everything, you had something to show for it.
Yeah, you have to do the work. You have to hopefully be good at what you're doing. You have to do your 10,000 hours. Yeah, all of that stuff. And and some of it is just pure shoe leather. I mean, like you said, I had my book, which again didn't sell very well, but I knew would at least get me to cons where I could sell it in artist alleys. And so I went to any artist alley I could get into, from little conventions at hotels to like things at fire stations. Mm-hmm. And I'd sit there and I would make friends with the person next to me and the person next to me. And I would collect, back then it was business cards, right? That's how old I am, but it was all about handing out business cards, getting business cards back. And everyone comes on following up with all those people and being like, hey, just to know you. And just, yeah, I mean, for 2-3 years, I did that. I worked that scene trying to just, I could do a whole con, whatever, lose a ton of money. And if I got the business card of one editor at one comic, I'd be like, that was it. This whole con was for that 2 seconds where this guy walked by and shook my hand and said, oh, I'm an assistant editor at Dark Horse or whatever. And you're like, okay, yeah, give me your card. Yeah, it was all about that.
That's the way to do it.
Got to work and work.
With Sheriff, did you have to clear all that stuff with the agency?
Yeah, Sheriff was the only book I've written where it was obviously fiction. I didn't write about being a CI, anything about others. There's a CISer in there, but yeah, that was, I was like, this is close enough to what I did that I want to get it clear to make sure it's officially and good. Yeah, so every script of Sheriff was submitted to the agency and approved ahead of time. By the end of it, it was really quick. I think mostly because the people who, CIA produces a lot of academics who do these very long academic papers on let me tell you about whatever, communist revolution in the Congo in 1969 or something. And I'm like, here's a comic book. So I think they're like, yeah, give me that one. So they're very nice about it and very, very fast. It was weird, but okay. Yeah.
It'd make a great film, I think.
Yeah. Someday we're working on it. We're working on it. We have Mitch and I have the rights that we for about 10 years, DC had the rights. We finally got them back. So,
oh, that's great.
Yeah. So that's good.
I was curious how that experience, if you can and want to talk about it, changed your outlook on global politics. Yeah. I mean,
the CIA influenced it, I guess, tremendously. I mean, CIA, when I was in was a fairly conservative organization, and I was in it at a weird time where I was like, okay, I think I joined to fight Al Qaeda, and then I got in, and 2 weeks later, like, oh, go to Iraq. I was like, is that work? That's who? What? Why are we here? Like, are we supposed to be over there? Probably the way it fundamentally affected me is just, I've seen people at their utter worst and desperate, and from all sorts of walks of lands and cultures, and I've seen that everyone has this sort of spark of humanity in them. And then you can sort of never ignore that fact that, like, you think the people who are over there are alien, but they're the same as you, and they have rights and they have and feelings, and then you should be as compassionate to them as you can. I don't know. If anything, probably that.
You did make something that I thought was very powerful and not afraid of that sort of controversy, which was Black Death in America.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was one of the first things I wrote. I remember our assignment was to write anything having to do with the color black, and I wrote about this hero whose nickname was Black Death.
Mm-hmm. Henry Johnson. Yeah, it was amazing. And I mean, the key to that, I mean, the late J.P. Leon drew the crap out of it. Well, I love so many things about that story. One of the first things I love is I got to do it in black and white. I never do anything in black and white. It was so nice. It was nice to embrace sort of my artsy indie side. And I write these sort of big mainstream books. Mm-hmm. That thing wrote itself because I found some, thank God, public domain records of him sort of telling his own story. And then I just put that, telling his story of sort of what happened in the war. Like he's known as, I mean, you look it up, like one of the greatest one-day heroes of all time, just in terms of what he accomplished on one military day. And then, how did I know his story? I think I just read an article on it or something. I knew like what happened to him and how he sort of got forgotten and got buried in kind of a pauper's grave at Arlington Cemetery. And so then I did research and told sort of the other sides. Then you have this easy, he tells in his own words the moment of his heroism, and then I show through images the results of that heroism afterwards. And that's such a perfect comic book thing, because in comic books you can contrast the words with the pictures to create this wonderful dissonant noise. I sort of let that go. I mean, I know there are people out there who are like, oh my God, it's political that you wrote a story about a black hero who got treated poorly and it implies he should have been treated better. I was like, that's political? Like, what side are you on? It should not be political.
That doesn't seem left or right to me,
well, nowadays.
Yeah. So.
Nowadays, it might be considered too DEI by some crowd.
Yeah, that's some of that stuff's out of your control, I suppose. Yeah. You just tell the best stories you can. Let people see them the way they see them.
You can, yeah. You should, I think, and I think it matters. I think story matters, and I think obviously your stories.
People say that, and you never know what to say, because you don't want to ever approach your stories with arrogance, or I don't. I don't know. It's to be like, oh yeah, I'm writing stories. I mean, you just be grateful that anyone had emotional response to your stories, I guess is the way I would put it. When
you talked about your kids and that job of, it seems like all of that is so sipped into yourself and as a person, that I see it in your writing, and it's very inspiring. I just think it's
what writing is all about. Yeah. If I could write the other way, where I didn't have to sort of land strip myself to make my books, I would do it. If someone would be like, oh, Tom, you write an impersonal action book that 500,000 people, I'd be like, yes, sign me up. How do I do it? Whenever I go away from that style, it just doesn't become me, and it becomes worse, and it sells worse. And so I end up going back to these very emotional or explorative books, the books I loved as a kid, the books I always want to read, which are not. I mean, don't get me wrong, I watch Die Hard every Christmas. I love those kind of movies, but even Die Hard, the reason it works is because the marriage, fundamentally care about that marriage relationship, right? Yeah. So I just think if you're not emotionally connected to people in stories, you don't really care about those people, and then what's the point in even watching it? Yeah.
And you found, I would say, or tried to portray the heart of the android, with vision, and that turned out extremely touching. And tell me the road to that. Was that a pitch of yours, or did an editor say, we have this character? What's your take on it? Or
no, it was my pitch. It was no, I didn't pitch vision. They gave me vision. I remember very specifically, I was writing Grayson at the time, or co-writing with Tim Seeley, and Marvel. I always wanted to write for Marvel. I was a Marvel zombie growing up. It was my dream. And a Marvel editor's like, hey, Tom, we have a character you thought you might do great at. And I was like, oh, it's going to be Winter Soldier because I'm the spy guy. I get it. And they're like, it's Vision. And you're like, Vision. Yay. Like, who cares about Vision? No offense. I was an Avenger guy growing up, so I knew a lot about him. But he's always like the fifth. He's like when you play basketball, he's like the sixth option on the team,
Yeah. Those are hard to pull off.
Yeah, those. So the way that worked, it was a convolution of facts. But basically, I was like, I was like, what? And you're like, what? Because you're looking for a pitch. Because I just wanted them to say yes. I just wanted to work for Marvel. So I was like, what do you want to write? You know, you don't want to tell them. You don't want them to be like, you don't want to tell them you don't have. Yeah, you don't want to tell them you don't have an idea, but you want them to tell you what idea they want. It's a complicated.
Exactly.
It's complicated back and forth. Where you're like, the more you tell me, the better. But I don't want to come across like I'm desperate. And they're like, we want sci-fi, and I was like, oh great. And so I'm like, I started constructing this pitch like vision in space, and they're like, sci-fi but without space. I was like, sci-fi but not space. It's like, what even is sci-fi without space? I was like, and then I was like, I guess like Frankenstein is sci-fi without space. I was like, so maybe it's a Frankenstein story. And I was like, okay, so the best Frankenstein is Bride of Frankenstein. I'm an old movie buff, so I'm like, Bride of Frankenstein, that's like the classic one, right? And I was like, okay, so Vision builds a wife. I was like, well, that is just Bride of Frankenstein. I was like, I'll get in trouble if I just do that. And she has big, and then I was like, okay, so it's a wife and kids. I was like, he builds a whole family. I was like, okay, that's something. So that's Bride of Frankenstein with a whole family. I was like, that's at least different. They live in the suburbs because he's like building a Leave It to Beaver family. I was like, okay. And then I was texting with a buddy of mine named Daryl. And he's like, do you have an idea for this Vision thing? I was like, yeah, the Vision builds a family. It's like, you know, it's like, and it moves to the suburbs. And he's like, that sounds boring. and I remember I immediately wrote back, and I was just, because I was watching Breaking Bad at the time, I was like, and because of that, he breaks bad. And that's how the pitch went from like one thing to another. It's like, oh, he discovers, and that drives him insane. And so that became the Vision pitch. And the reason, I mean, Vision made my career was sort of the phenomenon that launched me.
Yeah.
But it was written, I was writing a book called Omega Men at the time, and it got canceled. And Grayson was also getting canceled for reasons. And I was like, oh, so I have failed at this. I wrote the floppy novel, and I have written the floppy comic, and I got on stage and I can't play the instruments. And it was literally the week Vision was due. I was leaving. I was like, fuck it. I was like, I know this is going to cancel. I know nobody's going to like this. I'm going to write this comic, like the comic I want to write. Like, just throw out every single thing and write it just for myself, knowing nobody's going to like it. And I'm going to write it really artsy fartsy. I'm going to steal stuff from my favorite, you know, from Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Garth Ennis and Stan Lee and all those people. And I put that out there into the world, and, you know, miracles happen. It caught on, and a year later I was, you know, they gave me Batman. You know,
crazy. But that's like the Stan Lee way of making the Marvel universe, right? He knew that they were going to close shop, and he had the freedom in the world to do whatever he wanted, and that's what came out of it, you know.
Sometimes you just have to say, you know, fuck it and do it.
It's that attitude, you know, it's the attitude of doing something that you might be too careful or too precious to do sometimes. There's a lesson in there for sure.
That's right.
I had the good fortune of meeting Stan Lee, and I was wondering if you had an experience, a story with him.
Both times I met him were like incredible experiences. The second time was the funnier one, because I was supposed to do a thing. They had proposed to me. Stanley used to have his own Comic-Con in LA. Mm-hmm. And they're like, Stan says, if you come out to the Comic-Con, you can interview Stan on stage about comics. And Greg Capullo, they approached him too. And they're like, you and Greg will interview Stan together. And I was like, yes, I will come. I didn't want to go because it was just like not a good con or time. I was like, I will come to your con just to do this. I was like, you'll have 20 minutes. And I was like, yes, put me on stage with Stan Lee where I can interview him for 20 minutes. And Greg and I were there, and we, you know, the whole con, and we were ready to go. And it was right before our panel, and the Sabrina the Teenage Witch panel went long. And they're like, sorry, we're canceling. We're not doing the interview.
Oh,
like,
man.
No. And I had done, you know, I'm obviously like, I'm a research nut and I'm a comic book history nut. So I had spent, you know, I had reread the entire Fantastic Four run. I had reread the entire Amazing Spider-Man run. I had read like 3 biographies of him. I'd read all his old interviews. I knew everything at that point about Stan Lee that you could possibly know. And I was going to be completely useless. Like, I'd never used any of it. And they're like, do you want to meet Stan real quick just because you came all the way? I was like, yeah, I'll go meet him. And, you know, I met him. I gave him a book. He signed it. And I was like, I had 1 second. I could say one thing to Stan Lee. And I knew from my research that he had written copy during World War II. When he was in World War II, he had written copies about venereal disease to keep
Yeah. The soldiers from getting him.
Yeah, to keep soldiers from getting venereal disease from sleeping with prostitutes. And his copy, he came up with what was VD, not me. That was like his thing. And so I right before the picture, I have it up here. You know, I whispered in his ear. I just said, "Hey Stan, VD, not me." And he started laughing hysterically. And he looks over to me, and I was like, "Save more lives in the Sherman tank." And he goes, "Damn right." And there's a picture of my office of me making Stan laugh with my venereal disease joke. A little whisper.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that was the second time I met him.
What a guy, right?
What a guy. Complicated, lots of layers to Stan. But I going back and reading his writing, it's still very, very good. I still like it.
It holds up. I mean, those first issues of those comics are like masterpieces, really, as far as I'm concerned. As far as creating a character from conflict and from just those stories are.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, like you can read Alan Moore's treatise on how Stan Corbett is his great. Alan Moore says that the comic book character is one dimensional, basically, like. Superhero wants to fight bad because he's good and they're bad, and that's one dimension. And then Stan Lee came along, he created two-dimensional superheroes. Spider-Man wants to fight bad guys because his uncle died. Daredevil wants to fight bad guys because his dad died. Like it's that, like he gives them one twist of motivation, which is a huge thing. And obviously Batman kind of paved the way for all of that.
Yeah.
But Stan perfected it. But to me, when I read his stuff looking back, I see a guy who had written romance comics in the 50s for 15 years. He had written like Millie the Model and I see what impresses me is there's all this soap opera in it, which makes it so much more elevated than if you read I'm a big DC Comics fan, but the DC Comics fans at the time it's not soap opera. It's all based on like the editor Julie Schwartz didn't give a fuck about who. It was just like, you have a girlfriend, you have a boyfriend. That element is completely missing. It's all like bad guy of the week, defeat the bad guy, go home. But Stan's comics, there's this like who's in love with who and who's like this like just like general hospital of it all that still is compelling.
And that when that bounced back into DC, I mean, that's what made Superman more interesting to me, was actually when that whole mechanic with Clark was developed was further,
Absolutely. Yeah, I always think of myself as a Marvel writer who's just been stuck at DC for 10 years.
How do you keep consistent those three-dimensional characters where they change from time to time what they do?
So Alan Moore goes on. This is in his How to Write Comics. If anyone hasn't read that book, it's the best book on writing comics ever.
Yeah.
And Alan Moore says, so that's two-dimensional, Stan. He's like, but we're trying to achieve something called three-dimensional characters, which is like you can have a random whim. Like maybe that day you don't want to save comics or save superheroes, or like not everything is logical. Not every decision you make makes sense. And sometimes you want two things at once. You both want to be skinny and you want to eat a donut, and it doesn't make sense so you eat half the donut. And you're like, what does this mean? Like that the illogic of humanity should leak into our work in a way that's not in comics. And that's what I'm always trying to go for, that sort of illogic of humanity where things don't quite line up and things don't, and there are sort of deeper levels and there are layers to things about love and hate and relationships, and that's a constant struggle in comics. We're obviously comics live. I mean, someone said comics live in a second act. You're a screenwriter, so obviously what that means. But like for people who don't know, when you're writing a movie, the first act is your setup. The second act is kind of like rising tension, and then the third act is where you settle things. And so comics sort of never leave that rising tension. They're just always in that second act. And so it's hard to write characters that have epiphanies, that have genuine understanding, have resolutions if you're living in that second act, because it doesn't belong there. It belongs in that third act, but you're never going to reach it if you're in comics. So Batman can never be like, oh, wow, you're right. It's kind of weird that my parents died and I've dedicated my life to this. Like, lots of people's parents die and they move on emotionally. Like you have to explore those problems without 100% solving them, and it's you got to dance on the needle to do that.
When you build an arc, I guess you have to come back to some sort of status quo, but you emotionally, how much do you get away with that sort of resolution or coming to terms with, or an epiphany at all? in comics.
I don't think in terms of like the Save the Cat sort of structure when I'm doing comics. I find it to be very binding. But yeah, I do think if I'm writing a story, I'm leading towards an epiphany that if a story is 12 hours long and that 11th hour, my hero is going to realize something about themselves, or they're going to not realize it. And that's the epiphany. I'm 100%. That's everything is about that. Everything is leading towards that moment. Yeah.
When I think about what you were saying about the three-dimensional characters, I think the problem many screenwriters have, maybe some comic book writers or aspiring writers have, is also that they're looking at comics. They're not necessarily looking at their own life and seeing how their behavior has different volumes. Knowing a character fully, I think, is understanding them at their peak, at their lowest depth. In every situation, you're going to know what their range of responses might be, and they might surprise themselves sometimes, like we do oftentimes. And I think if we writers are always keyed into our behavior and the real relationships we have, we're closer to bringing it forward than just relying on the comics and the books that we love, but not all of them are going to have the same depth, and you sometimes get stuck on the cliches, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, 90% of writing is like you think of the story and then all the cliches are in your head. They're just like, they flood you. And then you have to be like, all right, how do I remove these cliches? Like how do I, like we're just talking about like, okay, Vision creates a wife. That's a cliche. That's literally the Bride of Frankenstein. How do we remove that? How do I brush those away to get at something interesting? Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's, people do have that trouble in superhero comics. I mean, some people don't. That you can sort of take advantage of these characters because for so many reasons they've been written poorly in this situation. So you're like, oh, I don't have to pay attention to that. This has to be all about plot. This is like what people want from this book. And don't get me wrong, I don't have my hand on the pulse. I don't exactly know what people want. I know what I want. Mm-hmm. So I'm only speaking from not in terms of like hitting a big audience, but in terms of just making what I think is great comics. Is that everything boils down to character. Everything is about a personal experience. Everything is biography. Everything is empathy, and all the plot mechanics of all that's just like we were talking about before. The plot is just Spock and bones, man. Those are just parts that are outside of your body that are pointing back to the inside. Mm-hmm. Just that's how I write, sort of from the inside out.
It shows.
Yeah.
Something I'm very curious about, because I've really only done, like, the comics work that I've done, I've written and drawn. So I don't know, but I've seen like this talent that you have for really writing to the artist's strengths. So if we could go through like your collaboration with Mitch, sure. And just, Smallwood, and just what sticks in your mind as the key moments of those collaborations that felt particularly meaningful to you.
And Mitch and I have been doing it for over a decade, and I'm the godfather of his kids. We talk every single day. Mm-hmm. Where Smallwood and I don't think we've ever talked in person before. I've never met him. Wow. I never had a phone call with him. Mm-hmm. We've been on Zooms, we've been interviewed at the same time, but we've never like Zoomed with each other. So, I mean, they're very different sort of things. I mean, Mitch was so good just off the bat. I mean, the first time, I loved him beforehand. I used to follow this little blog he used to do called Twart, which was Twitter art. And just thought he was utterly brilliant. And what was great about Mitch from day one is that he was game to do this super hard stuff. Sheriff goes all over the place. There's like full frontal male nudity and a double page splash, and there's 9-panel grids that are like, there's a phone conversation that goes on, I think, for 3 pages of 9-panel grids, which are 4 pages. What is that? 36 panels that are just a lady talking on a phone. And, and Mitch was able to make that compelling. I remember I was like, oh my God. And then what really stunned me about Mitch, I've told him about this, is he was well known as like the military guy. Like he did military comics, and he, if you needed a gun drawn, Mitch would do it. And he was on Punisher before I met him. And then we ended up on Mr. Miracle by just a bizarre turn of events. And he started doing these like sci-fi stuff, and I was like, "Oh my god, you can do this too!" Like you, I remember I do very thing, the Mr. Miracle 2 cover, which is like him with a gun looking up, and a demon is coming down. I was like, "Oh my god, like I didn't know you could do this too." There's two things I love about Mitch is that we're utterly on the same page in terms of. I often write comics. Clayman, another great friend of me, makes fun of me because I write what he calls flip book comics. I write comics in terms of I do scenes and montages. I don't mix those two up. A lot of people don't write comics that way. They in terms of how time passes. I mean, and I'll tell this here. They used to call it decompression. You know, Bendis did this. He was like sort of and Kevin Smith did this a lot. But like a lot of times in my comics, people, you know, you'll have a guy who has a soda, and so like panel 1 he grabs the soda, panel 2 he opens the soda, panel 3 he drinks the soda, panel 4 he says ah. Another comic book writer will represent that as okay. He drinks the soda, says ah. Next panel, he punches the bad guy. Like I put in a lot of scenes instead of montages, and I separate them out. And Mitch has been very on board for that in terms of constructing scenes that way inside out. So it's very filmetic, for lack of a better word. It feels very much like you're watching a movie.
Cinematic,
yeah. And he's been a great partner all the way. He adds so much, the glitches and just brilliant. And he represents emotions, and he does little things with his. He can do movement. Mitch is the best. Is absolute joy. Greg is a completely different beast because I had no idea how good Greg was when I first worked with him. An editor offered him, I'd write his Moon Knight stuff. I was like, that's pretty good. And I actually, the reason I really was excited because I liked some of his Archie stuff. I was like, this Archie stuff he did was good. But I thought Human Target was just a whim. You know, I was like, it was a stupid Twitter joke. An editor turned into something. Mm-hmm. And back then I was writing everything at once, and he did the cover for Human Target #1. And had turned it in. I was writing the first issue. He turned in the cover. I was like, oh my god! I was like, oh, so that's what this book is. I had no I was like, oh, this is we're doing like a George Clooney. We're doing like a Steven Soderbergh book. And I was like, oh my god, you can do this? Like that is. And from that one image, I wrote the entire series. I did 12 issues before I saw another piece of art that he turned in. I'm bad at so many things we've talked about, but the one magical power I have, and it comes from doing my 10,000 hours of reading so many comics, is I can very much picture in my head while I'm writing. When I'm writing, that's like the Matrix. I don't see the little streams of yellow. I see the pictures that are going to be drawn. Mm-hmm. And so once I sort of had Greg in my head, I saw exactly what I was going to do. I was like, oh my, this is going to be beautiful. I was just writing for Greg last week, and I hope I did him well. Greg is just absolutely stunning. I still can't believe I got to work with him. Human Target is one of those books. I don't sell it by the writing. I sell it by art. So just come see the best. See how good art and comics can be.
And Wilkes is a whole other type of collaboration now, right? Because not only Supergirl, but Helen of Wyndthorn is I guess you co-own that.
Yeah, Helen of Wyndthorn. Yeah, we co-own it. Yeah. I've been with Bilkis now for 5 years. I just met her for the first time the other day. What a wonderfully nice human being. Bilkis is a totally separate thing from those two. Mostly because, and I'm not saying like Greg and Mitch push themselves and push limits, but with Bilkis, I'll be like, Supergirl leans against a door and she'll draw a door unlike any door you've ever seen with 1,000. She's always looking more. I hate admitting this because my friends will be mad at me, but like after issue 5 of Helen, I wrote her a note and I said, this is the prettiest comic I've ever worked on. And I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of comics. I was like, I've never seen a comic that looks as good as this one.
It's like every cloud, every shard of grass, every
monster has second. And obviously she works with her partner Matthias, and they elevate it together. He does the colors. Yeah, she just makes she makes the plain into beauty, and it boggles the mind. Yeah. So some of these people I work with they're geniuses. There's no other way to describe it. One of the other superpower I have is that I can't draw at all, 0. I'm one of the worst artists you've ever seen in your life. So
I've seen your doodles. I like that.
Yes,
they're funny.
They're absolutely terrible. So I have no concept of like draw this angle or draw that angle or look. All I can tell you is so I think because of because of that, I don't get in my artist's way. I don't kind of have that bug in me. It's most comic book writers start out as artists. Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, Scott Snyder, most of them have some ability to sort of be like, oh, draw this, draw that. But I don't have that at all. To me, it's all magic. It's like you're doing a trick. I don't get it. I can't do it. To me, it would be easier for me to learn how to fly than learn how to draw.
Did you already have her in mind? Did you both come up with the concept, or did you have this concept because you knew what she could pull off with Helen, of those worlds and that sort of metafictional working at all levels?
After Supergirl, I sent her an email. I was like, whatever you want to do, I'll do it. I don't care what it is. You want to do cereal box covers? I'll write cereal box covers for you. And she said, I want to do something indie. And I was like, what do you want to draw? What interests you? And she sent me a mood board of the things that interested you. And it was like this, it was old, like an Alex Raymond sort of space stuff. But it was also like fashion stuff from the 30s. And it was kind of retro space, like 1930s comic strip art, which I also have a deep love for. And so from that, I was like, okay, I'm going to build a world. I'm going to do a little retro, but it's going to be fantasy. And at the time, I really was sort of playing with this idea of, the Gothic novel and its power in the 60s and 70s. And also I was really obsessed with Conan. So I combined my obsession with Gotham novels with Conan, with her mood board, and came up with this idea of the basic premise of a Gothic cliche is a young woman goes to a house that is big and mysterious and rich. And usually there's a caretaker in the house, and she falls in love with him first she's scared of the house, then she falls in love with the house, then she falls in love with the caretaker. And that's kind of what Gothic romance is. And so I was kind of do that differently, where it's a young woman goes to a house, but it's about her grandfather and her understanding her grandfather. Her grandfather is secretly Conan. So
Barnabas, aka Othan.
Or Othan, yeah. So I combined her mood board with two of my obsessions, and that became
that worked out great.
Yeah, it's one of the best things.
I was wondering if, because I love the metafictional aspect of it, I'm a big fan of Borges, and my work is
of course, much about metaphysics. A huge Borges guy. I think about his proof for the existence of God like all the time. So yeah, I understand. Yeah, Borges is big influence.
And I don't know if you're familiar with Cortázar.
No, I don't know.
Argentinian. He has one story after I made my first film. Somebody said, "Oh, you got to check this out." And it's called Noche Boca Arriba, which is the night upside down. And I think if you like Borges, you'll really enjoy that type of writing.
Awesome. All right, I'll check it. I'll check it
out for sure. Actually, Helen of Wyndthorn reminds me a little bit of Borges the South. In that change of realities.
Thanks. Again, it's all like, it has these big moments of like big dragons and stuff, but it's about bonding between a grandfather and a daughter over this son who committed suicide, and sort of, and how that affected them both. Like that's all. It always goes back to the center, like you're saying. It's always about that.
Yeah. I was touched by the characterization that you had, not only, of course, of the two main leads, but also to write a character that feels real in its absence, like C.K. Cole. I thought you pulled that up really well, just from what everybody feels and remembers, and it's very touching.
It's easy to do when you got Bilkis on it, man. Just makes it look. She just has. It's like working with a net. You just know it's going to be beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Did you know from the start you wanted to do it at Dark Horse, or how did that end up there?
No, we started it just doing it on our own. We did it and wrote it and started. I think we were like on issue 3 before we sold it to somebody. I had done Elsa Charretier, and I had done a book called Low Everlasting with Image. I was probably the last guy to enter sort of the indie realm. I was really happy with doing superheroes, because I was doing anything I wanted to do indie comics wise. I was doing with superheroes. Like you can't say that Vision doesn't like. I was doing indie comics, but I just happened to be doing them on a big stage. So yeah, I didn't love working with it. I mean, Lord knows I'll go back, but Image was just a little too much. I write so much, as we talked about offline before it started, that with Image, because you're basically your own creator, you're your own editor, you're your own everything. There was just too much extra work, and I needed that part off my plate. And sort of Dark Horse took that stuff off our plate, but still let us keep the rights, which was amazing. So yeah, so Dark Horse. I'm developing like 3 more books with them. I really enjoy working.
The type of deal that which is what I'm most interested in, which is keeping the rights to the things we do. That Image has, and just looking at the options look pretty good. But then I'm glad Dark Horse allowed you to keep that.
That's obviously the most important thing is just making sure I keep hold of those. Having gone through with Mitch and I went through on Sheriff, trying to get the rights back to Sheriff for a decade, which was horrible. I would never sort of do an indie comic where I don't control the rights anymore.
And we haven't touched Up in the Sky. We haven't touched.
We've done a lot. Right.
We haven't touched the Batman run. Just that tiny little thing there.
I'll have to come back and do some more.
We'll have to do that. For now, tell me a little bit about the amazing new run on Wonder Woman and Trinity.
I appreciate you bringing it up, man. Because I forget to promote my stuff, so you're so kind to bring it up. So my comic book work, I wrote 4 comic books a month. That's sort of where I've always been. And for the first time, that's starting to narrow. You're seeing the result of working on Lanterns last year. And if it feels weird to only have like 1 or 2 comic books out each month, it just feels very bizarre to me. Usually have like one or 2 a week.
Wow.
And but right now, so I've narrowed it down to kind of this Wonder Woman world. Daniel Sampere and I are on Wonder Woman together. And we're doing a long run. We're just finishing sort of our first big bad guy, the Sovereign, who's like this kind of evil secret king of America. And then we're moving on to our new arc, which the big bad is Mouse Man, which sounds so ridiculous. But I what we're doing with it, if you like like the way we took Kite Man from not being very much to being something big, Mouse Man's going to be like huge. I don't know. We're turning Mouse Man into like a huge villain, in a frightening, crazy sort of way. And I couldn't be more excited with what we're doing. And more details will be coming, but yeah, that starts pretty soon. And Daniel will finish this arc, and then that's and there's like
the art is incredible.
Yeah, the art, Daniel's just brilliant what he does. But Guillaume March is coming on for a few issues, and it's so brilliant. He hates me. I put him on a 9-panel grid. I hadn't done 9-panel grids in a while. But we're doing a kind of True Detective with Wonder Woman and Batman on Mount Olympus. It's so
cool.
And it's just 2 issues of like a murder mystery with Batman and Robin with Batman and Wonder Woman as the detective solving it. It's so much. It's awesome and kind of deep and dark. It's wonderful. So our big Mouse Man arc starts soon. And then I just announced Elena Ortega and I, who have been doing these sort of Wonder Woman. It was a 30-page comic, and Daniel and I did the opening, and then in the last 10 pages I would do these little side things about Wonder Woman's daughter in the future, which were written, which is, I've written such sad, depressing comics, and I wanted to write a fun comic, like a comic that's actually exciting and has large stakes and is super cool, but is, for lack of a better word, will make you laugh and is a little silly. And so something, my daughter, these are the only comics my kids like that I write. They actually like, oh, what happens next? What is this about? So Belén Ortega, who does this kind of a little manga-esque European style, which I love so much and works so perfectly for this. We're turning those little backup treats, because they were very popular, into its own series, its own 6-issue series that's all about. It's the silliest fucking comic of all time, but it's wonderful. It's the 3 trinities of the future. So you see, these are all daughters of Wonder Woman. You see a 6-year-old Lizzie, a teenage Lizzie, and a 20-year-old Lizzie. All of their various Robins have been turned into corgis. This will make sense in the comic. Actually, probably won't, but it makes and they've gotten scattered through time. So it's these 3 sisters basically chasing corgis throughout the DC universe, going on various adventures. The first one is sort of 6-year-old Lizzie in her tutu dressed as Robin, going to Crisis on Infinite Earth as the whole world is collapsing, and she's just chasing this super corgi puppy through this horrible landscape. And
That's what we love, man. Not only emotional depth, but your fearlessness for the ridiculous is incredible.
Utterly ridiculous, but it's all about, because obviously Steve Trevor died, and it's all about sort of their relation. Bizarrely, it's about what it is to not have a father, and sort of the longing for having a father is the sort of the central emotional arc. But it's also mostly about these three girls chasing these 9 corgis.
Looking so much forward to it, man.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Oh man, I appreciate you. I really appreciate you at every level.
Of course. Appreciate you, man. You take care.
Talk soon.
Thanks, man.
Okay.
Take care.